you get that, whether it's on your phone, in the pew in front of you, one that you carried with you. Some of you old-fashioned guys are still carrying those paper Bibles around. Yeah, maybe it's good to have them. I'm just teasing. I prefer them on it. Turn to Matthew 14. We read this earlier, 22 through 26, as we're continuing to go through the 52 stories that we started back in January that found a formation for our faith and our practice. I remember wanting the youth whose spiritual growth I was entrusted with to learn how to better trust Jesus. I had a bunch of high school kids, and I wanted them to learn this. And they just didn't seem to have the attention at the time, so I was trying to help them. And so I started weaving into our youth group gatherings different sort of trust-building experiences that I'd read about in an ideas book that was supposed to do this very thing, teach them to trust. I'm sure you've heard of some of these. We did the trust fall. We got the kids to stand up on a chair. We blindfolded them. We got the other kids standing behind them, and they were just supposed to stiff it out and just fall off the back of the chair, and their friends were going to catch them and get them down to the ground without breaking anything. That usually went pretty good until you had the big kid in the group, and they were always a little more iffy. They're kind of like, I don't know if these guys are really going to catch me. I'm a big guy. We never had any problems, but it was hard to do. And I did it myself, trusting those kids to catch me. And you say, yeah, you just got to fall back and see how that works. Another one we did was to take some fishing line, and we just wove it all over our education wing. In and out, around, through the whole thing, upstairs, downstairs. And we blindfolded the kids, and they had to hold on to that fishing line and follow it. And we placed some of our youth sponsors along the way to discourage them, to misguide them, to challenge them that they really hadn't heard the instructions right, and it was okay to let go of the string and go a different direction, since they already really knew what the room was like and their experiences. And another part of it was is if they got separated from the line, they could either try to find it on their own accord, or they could call out for help, and then they would have to wait for that help to show up and get them back on track. It was a great experience. The kids always, we would debrief afterward and talk about our lessons of trust and how it related to our faith. It was what a lot of people would now just call a team-building experience. But it was focused on trust, and how do we learn to relate that to trusting to the Lord? Jesus wanted his disciples to trust him even more than they did when they first started following him. Our trust is always in development. And we find in today's story an occasion where that happened. Did you notice when the first part of today's story was being read earlier in our service that Matthew begins telling this great story of Jesus walking on the water with the word immediately? That was his way, or it was common back then, of indicating this was the very next thing that took place. There was no in-between, no lapse of time, no lapse of days. It happened next. It happened immediately. It happened euthos. It happened at the end of what had already been a very long day. The disciples had just returned from preaching among the Galilean villages, and I'm sure they wanted to tell Jesus all the amazing things that had transpired while they were out there. But the crowds that had started gathering because they had heard that Jesus was back in time didn't give them a chance to report what had happened with them on this journey. And Jesus himself had received some news that he wanted to share with them. This was right after Jesus got the news of John the Baptist being killed, and it was weighing heavy on his heart. And at least according to the Gospels, he hasn't taken any time yet to be alone, to sort of work through that in prayer, as we all do when we lose someone we love. That's when Jesus told his disciples, in the midst of this pressing into the crowd, to get into a boat so they could escape to a deserted place a little further up the coastline. But the crowds see them leave, and they hurriedly go along the shoreline trying to stay up with them. There was a headwind that day, and so the disciples really weren't going too far along the shore. People were sort of staying up with them. And Jesus, out of compassion, had the disciples land the boat once they got far enough out of the city into what was a deserted place. The crowd gathers around, and Jesus has them sit on the green grass that was there. And he begins to teach them because they looked to Jesus like sheep without a shepherd. As the day drew on, the crowd builds up to over 5,000 men, and that doesn't include the women and the children. And as evening approached, the disciples, ready to finally get that alone time with Jesus, urged him to send them away. We kind of had enough of all these people. After all, they added, trying to make their case, it was kind of getting near supper time. And they needed to get back to wherever they'd come from to take care of their needs. It would be the compassionate thing to do to send them away, since they didn't have any means of feeding all these people out in the middle of nowhere. The disciples' attitude toward the crowd was what led Jesus to teach them the lesson of the loaves by feeding this enormous crowd with the contents of a young boy's lunch, 5 pieces of bread and 2 fish. It was a lesson not only about trusting God to provide, but about asking Jesus to provide. It was a lesson his disciples had not yet learned. It was immediately, that word that begins our story, after the disciples had picked up the leftovers, which filled up 12 baskets, one for each of the disciples, that Jesus would finally break up that crowd. By reading all of the gospel accounts, if you were to do that, we learned that Jesus also wanted to dismiss this crowd that had gathered because it had been the end of a very long day. He was ready for that alone time. And it was also because many of those who had been fed on that day wanted to make Jesus their king. Some Bible scholars have suggested that this was because their desire that Jesus be like a Moses to them. That he would be their leader, and he'd be the one that would feed them in the wilderness like he had just done that day. And he would be the one to give them sort of a new law like he was teaching them on it. But Jesus was no new Moses. He wasn't giving them some new law to follow. He had come for such more, to do such more for them. It was then, sort of to make sure that the crowd really dispersed, that Jesus sent his disciples back into the boat and to head up the coast on to Capernaum while he headed off into the mountains alone to pray. Their leaving had the desired effect. The crowd, with nothing to draw them there, begins to disperse. It withers away. But they took with them the stories of their experiences with Jesus that day, which they must have shared with anyone and everyone who would listen. While Jesus was up on the mountain praying, the disciples were in the boat rowing. The weather started getting rough. The tiny ship was tossed, but not for the courage of the fearless crew. Now hold on a second. Those are those lyrics about that song in the Minnows' ill-fated 3-hour tour. The disciples' skipper wasn't on board, but they had their orders from him. And despite the storm that raged and roared all around them, they kept rowing away, heading toward Capernaum. It must have been tempting to do otherwise, but they had learned to trust Jesus, even though they were relying on their own strength to do it. Their very long day was turning into a very long night. No rest for the righteous. The disciples must have been completely exhausted. Rowing for the safety of the shore must have crossed their minds more than once. If nothing else, they could just stop for a bit and rest. But they trusted Jesus enough to keep obeying his command. So they keep rowing. Even if they weren't making much headway against this storm that roared all around them, even if they were starting to run on empty and energy must have been failing, on and on through this night, they keep rowing away. I found it interesting that it was not the storm nor the waves that frightened the disciples that night. It was seeing Jesus at the fourth watch of the night walking on the water that frightened them. They divided their day into 12 hours and the night into 4 watches. It wasn't an exact way to keep track of time because of the changing of seasons, but it was close enough to kind of keep track of things. If you were to do that today over in Galilee, their sunrise began at 6:37, and nighttime was 6:14, so just a little bit over 12 hours. The fourth watch is about 3 a.m. That means that the disciples, after a really long day, had been rowing against this storm for about 9 hours, completely exhausted. They see Jesus plain as day, walking through the storm on the water effortlessly. He was not, according to Mark's gospel, headed toward them, but he seems like he's going to pass right by them, like he's going to keep on walking to their final destination and just leave them by. What were the disciples to make of what they were seeing? Instead of applying the lesson of loaves to their current situation, they relied on their cultural understandings to help them interpret what they were seeing. They knew that people can't move across the sea as they were witnessing Jesus do. But they believed that ghosts could. And that's what they tried to convince each other they were really seeing out there. It was just a ghost that looked like Jesus. It was the only thing that made sense to them. And seeing a ghost, their word phantasm, was enough to make these grown men shriek in terror. I'm sure that Jesus was fully aware of what they were thinking and what they were feeling, but it is only after they gave in to their fears that Jesus speaks to them. It makes me wonder how they could possibly have heard what he said in the midst of a raging storm. But we are told that they did. And it is what Jesus said to them that calms their fears about his identity. He simply affirms that it really is himself. He was no ghost. He tells them, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. Matthew tells us how Peter then requests a sign of Jesus, a confirmation that it really was him standing on the waves. Peter asks him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Peter's request was not like that of the Pharisees. They only asked Jesus to show them a sign to prove that he was the Messiah. Of course, the Pharisees didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, and they thought that if Jesus tried to do something and failed, it would help them show that he was just a fraud. Jesus would tell them on those occasions that they'd received no sign except the sign of Jonah, a reference to his death, burial, and resurrection. Peter was not like the Pharisees. Peter believed that Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God. Peter had accepted Jesus as his Lord. He was faithfully following him, obeying his commands the best he could. Peter believed that Jesus could do the impossible, and Peter believed that if Jesus commanded him to walk on the water, then he'd be able to walk on the water. Let me interject here that we ought to be very careful what we want Jesus to command us to do. He might just command us to do something impossible, not to test our faith, but to give us the opportunity to step out in faith. Now wait a minute. He has commanded us to do something impossible, hasn't he? He's commanded us to make more and better disciples. And when we look at the ones who are lost in our lives, that seems like an impossibility. But like the disciples, we're willing to obey. We reach out to the lost. But as the disciples were doing that night, we usually do so by relying on our own strength rather than on the power of Jesus. Jesus commanded Peter to come, and Peter obeyed. Peter gets out of the boat. Peter steps on the water. Peter does the impossible. He begins to walk, and he is supported by it. We don't know how many steps Peter takes, but he didn't quite make it all the way to wherever Jesus was. The wind and the waves remind him that he's doing the impossible, and that's when doubt sets in. Peter begins to sink. Not before walking on the water, but after doing the impossible. He cries out in a panic to Jesus those words that we have all cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus was near enough to take hold of Peter, saying to him, saving him. And Jesus sort of leans into Peter and he says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" I want to point out that only having a little faith is not the problem. Jesus once said, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. It was the doubting that was the problem. The word translated doubt literally means to duplicate. It was their word for doing it twice. We still talk that way today. We tell people, don't think twice about it. And that's what Peter had started to do. He was starting to think twice about what he was doing. Instead of just doing it, he started thinking. We often have trouble that way in our community. We're a bunch of thinkers. And we start to do things, and then we start thinking, and then we start analyzing, and the next thing we know, we're like, well, we can't do this. This is impossible. It also reminded me, as I was studying this, of my favorite line out of the recent Top Gun movie. I don't know if you've seen it yet or not, but Maverick keeps telling a younger pilot, don't think, just do. And later in the movie, whenever this young pilot acts by doing instead of thinking, he ends up saving Maverick's life, but in the process, he almost kills himself, and Maverick is so upset about him putting himself in danger, he runs over to him, knocks him over, and he says, "What were you thinking?" And he answers, "You told me not to think." I like that line. Jesus and Peter standing on the water together. I don't think Peter was thinking anymore. He gets to walk back to the boat on the water with Jesus, not thinking about it, just doing it. And whenever they step back onto the boat, it tells us that the storm subsides. They had seen Jesus calm the storm before. We studied that this last week, and now he's doing it again. How different things are when Jesus gets into the boat with us. They had been relying on their own strength, which was insufficient against the storm they were facing. They needed the power of Jesus. They needed their captain on board. Or did they? What's missing in the story is that the disciples never prayed to Jesus. They never cry out and say, "Jesus, can you help me?" Because he's off and far away. And I guess they don't think he can do anything unless he's present and right in the boat with them. But then again, maybe they haven't even known that was a possibility, something that they could do. But it is something that we're aware of, something we know that we can do. But even so, even though we know we can cry out to Jesus and ask for his help at any time, we often rely on our own strength instead of asking for his help. The disciples respond to what just happened the same way. Every one of them have the same knee-jerk reaction. We're told that they worship Jesus. The Greek word translated worship literally meant to kiss toward. But it's often translated to bow down, and that's what's in many English translations here. It was a spontaneous reaction. They didn't think about it. They just did it. Notice that they didn't break out in song. How many verses are we going to sing, boys? They didn't take up a collection. They didn't have one of them, "Okay, Peter, it's your turn, preach a sermon." They didn't say it's prayer time. They didn't say, let's have communion. Of course, that didn't come around yet. They didn't do the things that we associate with worship today. And these are all good things in our worship of God. But they worshiped him nonetheless, not out of fear, but with genuine faith. Acknowledging in that one moment that Jesus really is God's Son. In fact, that's what it says in the Scripture. It says that they understood that certainly he's God's Son. That should always be the focus of our worship. Of all the things we do when we gather here, we should leave with the experience that he's God's Son. He's the God who cares for us, and the God who loves us, the God who can do the impossible. He's God's Son, and we're his children. That should be part of the experience we have in worship. The disciples still had to row the boat, even though the storm had subsided. They were still exhausted. It was still the end of a long day that had turned into a long night, but it was smooth sailing, so to speak. And they quickly arrived in Gennesaret. I know that their destination was Capernaum, but Gennesaret is just about a mile, a little area outside of the city. And they get to their final destination, Capernaum, once they get to the shore. I'm going to ask our worship team to go ahead and come forward as we finish up together. As exhausted as the disciples were after pulling an all-nighter with Jesus, they did not get to rest, because the men of the city come out and greet them, and they immediately recognize Jesus, not as the disciples had just recognized him on the boat as God's Son, but as only someone who could do the impossible. Their response was not to fall in worship of Jesus, but to bring to Jesus all who were sick, asking only if the sick can touch the brim of his garment, that they might be healed. Evidently, they'd heard about the woman who'd done so in faith and was healed. They wanted, they hoped that the same thing would happen to the ones that they knew, the ones that they loved, the ones who needed that kind of healing in their life, that sort of help. They had faith in Jesus to heal, which is a step in the right direction. But Jesus wanted them to trust him. He wanted them to trust him as the one that God had sent to save them, to be the Messiah, the Christ, the one who can restore your relationship with God. The story ends with all those who touched the hem of his garment being healed. And that's a great part of the story. But I hope that your story ends by worshiping him as the disciples did on the boat, because you recognize him as the Son of God, the one who can bring the most powerful, improbable thing ever, the one who can forgive your sins and restore your relationship with God. And I hope that you bring with you those that you know who have not yet made Jesus the Lord of their lives as they brought their sick. To bring them with you one at a time, that they might come to know Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, who's come to save them. We're going to have a hymn of invitation or dedication. And I want you to use this time as we sing together to say, Jesus, I do worship you. You are the Son of God. And Lord, there is the impossible command that you've given us to go and make more disciples. Help me be faithful and help me use your power to do so. Would you please stand?